Hello, everybody. Here I am again with another topic from evolution, grade 12 biology. Then today we shall talk about one very important concept in evolution, that is speciation, and also types of speciation. This is part of neo-Darwinian evolution, of course. And let's go. Natural selection provides a mechanism by which new populations of a species can arise, of course. What does it mean? Speciation. New species from pre-existing one can be formed. But at what point can these populations be considered as distinct species? A new species forms when one portion of a population can no longer breed and produce fertile offspring with the rest of the population. You see, when we say a population undergoing evolution and changing it to a new species, speciation, and we can say the newly formed species is distinct species, and we consider it distinct, separate species because it can't reproduce with the ancestral species. And if it can reproduce, of course, it can produce viable and fertile offspring. You see, it has become different species, means they can't reproduce. If you bring them and allow them to reproduce, they can't reproduce. What does it mean? They are now reproductively isolated. You see, very important. In speciation, when a species is formed from pre-existing species, the pre-existing species and the new species has undergone what's known as reproductive isolation. Reproductively isolated. They can't reproduce, or if they reproduce, if zygote is formed, either the zygote is the embryo is aborted, or the embryo may grow and develop and be born, but either the offspring is not viable, it may stay a very short period of time, and before it reaches to reproductive age, it may perish or die. Or if it can survive long enough, it becomes sterile, just like remember the case of the mule obtained from the horse's egg and the donkey's sperm. You see, uh, that is, they are reproductively isolated. Underline this very important phrase, of course, reproductive isolation. When two species are reproductively isolated, we can say that they have become of two different species. The two separate groups no longer share a gene pool, and each begins to follow its own independent evolutionary path. You see? Therefore, this is a concept of speciation. New species is formed from the pre-existing one. How can we be sure that the new species is new species? Okay, the new species will not reproduce with the previous one. Therefore, we say that they are reproductively isolated. Thus, speciation is evolution of one or more species from pre-existing single species, and it occurs when members of a population become reproductively isolated. Exactly. If two populations become so different, individuals from these different populations cannot interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Then we must think of them as different species. What does it mean? Cannot interbreed to produce fertile offspring, which means they are reproductively isolated. Reproductively isolated. So we can say they are two different species. What does it mean reproductive isolation? Reproductively isolated means they can't reproduce and produce fertile offspring. There are a number of ways in which this can occur. The two main ways are, that means isolation, speciation. One, allopathic speciation. The other is sympatric speciation. These are the two main mechanisms by which a species becomes speciation happens. New species is formed in these two major mechanisms: allopathic speciation. This is in relation to the divergent evolution, when there is geographical barrier, one population split into two or more, each develop into a new species. Of course, allopathic speciation is related with divergent evolution, of course. The other is sympatric. Sympatric. While organisms are in the same habitat, geographical area, they can become different species. You see, we shall see one by one here. The first one, allopathic speciation, also known as geographic isolation. You see the term geography, divergent evolution. Allopathic speciation occurs when a population from an existing species becomes geographically isolated. Geographical barrier. Remember, geographical barrier. It is part of divergent evolution, of course. And the isolated population develops into a new species. New species. Physical barriers. What are these physical barriers? Like continental split, when the land masses split open by dividing, split open divides a population into two subpopulations, which can come together and interbreed so that they become different species. The rise in sea level could be formation of mountain ranges, advance of glaciers in polar areas. You see, mountains of ice may separate a population into. Change in habitat also can cause separation. When a habitat is changed, some of the members, because of scarcity in food and living space, may migrate and go and become different species. These geographical barriers prevent gene flow between populations of a species. You see, gene flow is prevented. Gene flow. You see, if you consider the human population, for example, the population in America, North America, and population in Africa, there is geographical barrier. There are oceans between land mass. We are geographically separated, but because of science and technology, we are not totally separated. We can contact and mix our genes so that we are not going to be different species. You see, in course of time, we are not going to produce reproductive isolation. You see, still the gene pool is mixing. The gene pool of American mixing with gene pool of Africa. The gene pool of Africa is mixing with gene pool of Europe and Asia. Therefore, the total human population is, though geographically isolated because of science and technology, like water travel, the ship and the airplane. There are many transport mechanisms which mixes up the whole population, allows reproduction amongst themselves. Therefore, for other animals, of course, physical barriers separate one population into two or more. In course of time, each undergo adaptive change, adaptive radiation. Each become different species. Therefore, allopathic speciation talks about this when a physical barrier separates a population into two or more. What are the physical barriers? This include continental split, when the land mass is split by rift valleys, rise in the sea level, formation of mountain ranges, advance of glaciers, change in habitat also is considered. And therefore, this prevent the gene flow between populations of species. And each separate population develops adaptation for its own habitat or ecosystem and finally becomes new species. Allopathic speciation, also known allopathic speciation occurs when population from an existing species become geographically isolated. This is redundancy of physical barriers, continental split. We have said this. Sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is when a species is changing while still in the same habitat. Sympatric speciation occurs when population from an existing species develops into a new species without becoming geographically isolated from other members of the original species. You see, they are living the same geographical area. There is no geographical isolation, but there are other isolating mechanisms that brings a productive isolation that makes them develop into new species. We shall talk about this. This is diagrammatic description. You see, this one is allopatric speciation, which is equal to geographical isolation. Isolation first. There is geographical isolation first, and geography. The geography is split into two. Now, when the geography is split into two, this has its own population, original population, split into two. This develops new adaptation for this ecosystem. This one develops, and at the end of time, that means over time, this become two different species derived from this ancestral species because of allopatric. They used to share the same fatherland. The fatherland splits into two and become two different ecosystems, develop into two different species. Sympatric speciation is just a speciation, just the same land system, the same geography, no splitting. Organisms, while living in the same geographical area, unable to reproduce and finally become different species. A new species forms when one portion of a population can no longer breed and produce fertile offspring with the rest of the population. That means reproductively isolated. That is, the two separate groups no longer share a gene pool and each begin to follow its own independent evolutionary paths. As long as two populations are able to interbreed, they are unlikely to evolve into distinct species. I have told you this already in the human population. As long as two populations, three populations, whatever, population of Africa, population of Asia, population of South America, as long as they are interbreeding, they are they are coming together and interbreeding, they are unlikely to evolve into distinct species. You see, if they have stopped interbreeding over a long period of time, they can become different, of course. They must somehow go through a period when they are prevented from interbreeding. What does it mean? There must be reproductive isolation. Both allopatric and sympatric speciation involve isolating mechanisms that prevent different populations from interbreeding for a period of time. In case of allopatric speciation, the geographical barrier separated organisms. And in the course of time, they became different. If you bring them, they will not reproduce because they have developed what? Reproductive isolation mechanisms. During this period, mutations that arise in one population cannot be passed to the other as a result of this. And the different selection pressure in different environments, genetic differences between the two populations increase. And over time, each subpopulation becomes with its own gene pool, which is different from the other, so that they have become different. They have developed different gene pools, so that if you bring them together, they can't reproduce. They have developed anatomical, structural barriers which prevent them from reproduction. They have developed isolating mechanisms. Eventually, the two populations will become so different that they will be unable to interbreed, or they are reproductively isolated. Underline this. Reproductive isolation is very important. Reproductive isolation has developed. What does it mean? They are already made to be unable to reproduce. Reproductive isolating mechanisms. There are. Let's now we shall talk about what are the mechanisms that makes the subpopulation to be different of different species. Reproductive isolation. How can we describe the reproductive isolating mechanisms? There are mechanisms, two major mechanisms of reproductive isolation are mechanisms that affect the ability of two species to become to combine gametes and form zygote and to reproduce and produce fertile offspring. These reproductive barriers fall into two major categories. One is pre-zygotic reproductive barriers, pre-zygotic, before the organisms mate and produce zygote, they are separate. Pre-zygotic reproductive barriers. The second, post-zygotic reproductive barriers. Let us see the first, pre-zygotic reproductive barriers. You see, a population is split into two or more. They developed their own adaptation in their own custom. They have developed their own gene pool, which is different from each other. Now, if you bring them and allow them to live in the same geography, they have already developed what? Reproductive isolating mechanism. What are these reproductive isolating mechanisms? One is pre-zygotic reproductive barriers. Pre-zygotic. These reproductive barriers act before fertilization to prevent individuals of different species or populations from mating. They don't mate, they can't mate because of pre-zygotic reproductive barriers. The second type is post-zygotic. Of course, these organisms can mate, they can make sexual intercourse. But after the formation of zygote, the reproductive barrier is after the formation of the zygote. They act after fertilization or after formation of zygote. That's why it's known as post-zygotic reproductive barriers, to prevent the development of viable offspring or to reduce the offspring fertility. For example, the case, in the case mule, the case of donkey and horse giving rise to a mule. They can make sexual intercourse. They can form zygote. The zygote undergoes embryonic development. The baby can be born, grows, develops, but unable to reproduce itself. This is post-zygotic reproductive mechanism. There are many different types. I will come to that. Anyway, first let's see the pre-zygotic reproductive barriers or mechanisms. Mechanisms of pre-zygotic reproductive isolation affects the ability of two species to combine gametes and form a zygote. These are obstacles that prevent zygote formation. These include ecological or habitat isolation. They are living in the same area but in different habitats, the same geographical area, the same ecology but different habitats. Say, for example, one organism living in the water in that geography, the other is living in tree branches. Imagine an insect. One is aquatic insect, the other is an insect which is arboreal, which is living on the branch of trees. Different habitats, you see. Unless they share habitats, they can't make sex and mix their genes and reproduce, so that they become two different species. Ecological or habitat isolation. The second is temporal isolation. It's time. Temporal refers to time. Time of reproduction. Season of reproduction. One may reproduce in the summer, the other reproduce in the winter. They can't synchronize their reproductive time, so they will remain being separate, different species in course of time. The other is behavioral or ethological isolation. Whenever it comes to reproduction, which behavior do you remember? Animal behavior, grade 11, unit 2, I think. Animal behavior. Courtship behavior. Ethology is animal behavior. Ethology is science that studies animal behavior. Ethological behavior. Which behavior? Not all behaviors. It specifically talks about sexual behaviors, particularly courtship behaviors. If two related populations have developed different courtship behaviors, they will not come together. Their language of courtship is changed. There is difference in courtship behavior, so that they will not understand each other. They will not consider each other as the same species, and in course of time they become too different. This is behavioral or ethological isolation mechanism. The other prezygotic mechanism is mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation. This specifically talks about body size. Body size. Imagine dogs. Big, the African Ethiopian bulldog, and puppy, small dogs. There is big size difference. Even to make sex, even the genitalia, even genitalia difference. Imagine human populations, two groups of human population. One group with large, huge genitalia. The other group, smaller genitalia. And this group contains females that can cope up with large genitalia if the genitalia difference, the sexual organ difference, prevents them from doing sex. Because having large penis may not allow healthy sexual relation. The female may, the sexual relation may become severely painful when the male has very extended penis. So there is no peaceful sex. The female will not allow that sex to happen because it's painful. Nobody resists pain, severe pain, of course. So, do you think the male can inseminate the female? No. So, if there is no insemination, there is no fertilization. I mean, zygote formation, fertilizing zygote. Therefore, they remain to be different species because of mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation, it could be, of course, even body size. Think of the American bull, that huge bull. Unless humans take the sperm from this bull and artificially inseminate it into the Borana cow for artificial insemination interbreeding, can that huge American bull naturally mount on the female and undergo normal sexual and to transmit? No, she can't stand. It's huge. It's very huge. The bull is very huge, so that the female can't resist that huge weight. So successful reproduction will not occur because of body size difference or difference in genitalia, incompatibility in genitalia. This talks about mechanical isolation mechanisms, mechanical isolation. All these are what? Pre-zygotic. Because of all this, there is no insemination, there is no formation of fertilization, there is no zygote formation, no embryo. Therefore, these are known as pre-zygotic reproductive mechanisms before formation of zygote. Let's see one by one, ecological or habitat isolation. A difference in habitat preference can separate two populations in the same geographical area. The same geographical area, habitat preference. As I have told you, one may live, for example, one species of ladybird beetle eats one type of plant, while a closely related species eats a different plant. The two never occur on the same host plant, although they reproduce freely in the laboratory. In natural environment, the two feed on different species of plants, so the chance that they come and reproduce will be reduced, so that in course of time they are going to be different species. This is what ecological or habitat isolation mechanism. The different habitat preference are the reproductive barriers that keeps the gene pool of the two species separate. There, they are prevented from mixing up their genes. The second, temporal or seasonal, you can call it seasonal, temporal or seasonal isolation mechanisms. And two species that share a habitat will not mate if they are active at different times of the day or each reproductive maturity, reach reproductive maturity at different times of the year or reproduce at different seasons. Example, orchid releasing pollens on different days. They can't pollinate each other. Different species of orchids releasing pollens on different days. They can't pollinate each other, so they will become different species. Behavioral or ethological, two populations are capable of interpreting but have differences in courtship rituals or courtship behavior or other reproductive strategies that may prevent two closely related populations that are capable of interpreting from mating. You see, because of difference in their reproductive strategies or courtship rituals, they become different species. The males of two species of tree frogs, for instance, use distinct calls to attract mates. Calls, the sound that they make. The male is making sound in frogs, of course. The female identifies the sound of its own species, you see, and responds only to the sound of its own type. So the two become, though they can reproduce, in course of time, their gene pools become different and finally become two different species. Likewise, sexual selection in many birds is based on intricate mating dances. See? Unless the female senses that the male dancing and vocalizing with sound, chirping, senses that this male is of its own species, it will not allow for sexual intercourse and reproduction. Differences in the gamete delivering or receiving structures between the male and female may prevent groups from interbreeding. Of course, in plants, no copulation, but mechanical barriers still apply. This is, of course, this is not part of behavioral. This is mechanical isolating mechanism. This it belongs to here. It's a mistake here. Mechanical isolation. Any change in the shape or size of the gamete delivering or gamete receiving structure, either the vagina, difference in vagina, the receiver, gamete delivering penis, if there is incompatibility, shape, size difference, this prevents the male gamete fusing into the female gamete and preventing zygote formation. This is mechanical isolation. In plants, males and females do not copulate, but mechanical barriers still apply. Mechanical barriers in females, the pollen, size of the pollen, the chemistry of the pollen may mechanically be prevented from forming pollen tube after it has landed on the stigma. You see, still mechanical isolating mechanism prevents plants. There is no copulation or sexual intercourse, but the pollen, after pollination, it reaches to the stigma. The stigma produces a mechanical barrier, membrane barrier, preventing the pollen from forming pollen tube and migrating into the ovule down there in the ovary. This is mechanical isolation, of course. The last is gametic isolation. Of course, consider gametic isolation. They may undergo sexual reproduction. Behavior is not preventing. Season is not preventing. Mechanical difference is not preventing. They make sexual intercourse. The gamete is released. It goes, and when the sperm reaches to the egg, they can't communicate properly. The egg may not allow the fusion of the sperm nucleus, gametic isolation. If a sperm can't fertilize an egg cell, then no reproduction will occur. For example, many marine organisms such as sea urchins simply release sperm and egg cells into the water. You see? Therefore, this is gametic isolation. The gametes are not communicating properly. Chemically, there are chemical barriers which prevent the male gamete from fertilizing the female. These are known as gametic isolation. Do you think the human sperm can fertilize hyena's egg or donkey's egg, more appropriately, of course? Donkey's egg? No. Why? Human males can make sex with donkey. Of course, it is bestiality of time, sorry. The sperms can migrate and reach to the ovary, the ovule, the fallopian tube, and if the egg is released, of course, they can meet. Yes. Do you think the human sperm can fuse with the female's egg? No. Because we are different species, chemical barriers are there. You see, chemical barriers. These gametes display unique surface molecules. You see, surface molecules that enable an egg to recognize sperm of the same species. You see, thus, in the absence of a match, if the egg can't recognize properly, fertilization will not occur, and the gene pools will remain separate. Okay, now to the second type of isolating mechanism, reproductive isolation mechanism, post-zygotic barriers. Now, no problem in barriers, no problem in pre-zygotic barriers. The organisms are living the same geographical area, the same habitat. They meet, they undergo sex. Fertilization can happen, but after fertilization, post-zygotic barriers tell you that these organisms have already developed into two different species. These isolating mechanisms act after the zygote formation and prevent viable or fertile offspring formation. Individuals of two different populations may produce a hybrid embryo, but post-zygotic isolating mechanism may keep them separate by selecting against the hybrid. Now, natural selection is acting on the hybrid. It prevents the hybrid from completing its embryonic development and being born healthy and viable. It may be aborted, or it may allow it develop and become born and immediately may die before reaching to sexual maturity, or it can reach, it can be born and develop and grow, but it becomes sterile. You see, collectively these post-zygotic barriers are sometimes called the hybrid incompatibility. Post-zygotic barriers or isolating mechanisms are also known as hybrid incompatibility, and their selection acts on the hybrid offspring. Hybrid offspring, imagine a horse and a mule. The selection is acting against mule, preventing the mule from reproducing. Therefore, this is post-zygotic barrier. The post-zygotic isolating mechanisms include 1. Hybrid inviability, 2. Hybrid infertility, the case of mule, this one, or sterility. 3. Hybrid breakdown. You see, everything is hybrid. Hybrid refers to the offspring. The offspring produced. Hybrid inviability, hybrid sterility or infertility, hybrid breakdown. Let's see one by one. Hybrid inviability. A hybrid embryo may die before reaching reproductive maturity. This is the case, typically because the genes of the parents are incompatible. The genes of the female and the male do not communicate and produce appropriate organism. Therefore, a hybrid embryo may die. It may be aborted or immediately die after it has been born. Hybrid infertility. This case is the case of the mule. This is when different species interbreed but to produce sterile offspring. Typical example is the case of donkey and horse giving rise to mule, which is sterile. The reason is, you see, horse has 64 chromosomes. The egg from the horse is 32. Donkey has 62 diploid number. The sperm from the donkey 31. Mix this. 32 plus 31, they got 63, odd number of chromosomes. Thus, mule possesses odd number of chromosomes plus non-homologous chromosomes which can't undergo meiosis to produce gametes. There is no appropriate meiosis occurring in the mule. That's why mule can't produce haploid cells for reproduction by meiosis. Okay, the third case, hybrid breakdown. What does it mean? Breakdown. Some species produce hybrid offspring that are fertile. When the hybrid reproduces, however, their offspring may have abnormalities that reduce their fitness. You see, hybrid produced in between two similar populations which have developed reproductive isolation. The hybrid is healthy, it is born It is not sterile, it is fertile. When the hybrid again reproduces, the offsprings are really weak. Sometimes this is known as F2 breakdown. They call it F2 breakdown because, you see, two parents, related parents, reproduce and produce offspring, which is the hybrid offspring, which is fertile. This is F1. The F1, the hybrid, the fertile hybrid multiplies, produces F2. The F2 now, the second filial generation, have a weakness. They may die early in their prenatal and postnatal age, or weak to reach to maturity, and this is hybrid breakdown or F2 breakdown, they call it. Just to recap, what are the post-zygotic three post-zygotic isolating mechanisms? Hybrid inviability, where the embryo breaks down, disintegrates, and is aborted. The second, hybrid sterility or infertility, in the case of the mule from horse and donkey. And the third, hybrid breakdown or F2 breakdown, where the F1 is normal, and the F1, when the F1 multiply with each other, they can produce viable and healthy and strong offspring. This is hybrid breakdown. For example, some second generation hybrid offspring of the mosquito species Aedes aegyptus and Aedes muscarensis have abnormal genitalia that make mating difficult. Sometimes this may also happen, you see. The F2 generation may have some abnormalities in their reproductive organs, so they can't make appropriate sex and transfer sperm cells from the male to the female. Reproduction will not occur unless sperms are transferred.